Okay, I see a little bit of New Jersey coming in, New Orleans, Texas, Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What is up, everybody? Sounds amazing. We got a good little mid-Atlantic, Plano coming in. Turtle Lake, Wisconsin. That sounds beautiful. We were just talking about the North Woods in Wisconsin with Sylvie here before you came on board. Turtle Lake. That just sounds nice. Town called Turtle Lake.
All right, let's get this going. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sylvie. I'm your webcast host today from HR.com. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, The Overlooked Risk Factor in Wellbeing, Why Toxic Behavior Undermines Your Best Initiatives, sponsored by Fama Technologies and presented by founder and CEO, Ben Mones. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credits. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, please click on the Q&A tab of your webinar controls and type them in there. And it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Ben for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. And yeah, thanks to all you for joining today. It promises to be a engaging and exciting session here. So, let's try to stay engaged, stay conversational. We've got, a nice little chat here that's active. There are questions that you can punch in. Sure, all of you, 5 years removed from COVID, have used Zoom before. But if not, there's a little button, it says Q&A. There's a little button called chat. Use your keyboard, type in the open text box, and you can engage with me that way. I know it's like mind-blowing, crazy that that's possible. But with that, let's hop into to today's session. This is me, as Sylvie said. This is me like 9 years ago, actually. So I had less gray hair, fewer kids than I have now, fewer bad experiences and all that. But I'm still here. I'm still standing. I'm still strong. I don't know if anyone knows that movie quote, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Weird dad jokes about movies. We're going to talk about well-being today. Well-being is a very popular theme and topic, that we've seen as of late in the world of work. And as companies begin sort of revisiting the sort of what I'll call ancient ideals of well-being and what that means in the workplace, revisiting that in a world of, connected infrastructure, Gen Z and millennials populating the workplace, right? The role of digital identity, this fundamental changes, even with my corny Zoom joke about the way that we work and the way that we engage. We're going to talk a lot about, where, traditional well-being programs that might have been based on a, more historical way of working short and how we can begin addressing them, with technology. We'll talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics, toxic behavior, womp womp, what employee screening is and isn't, and then how leading companies are staying ahead of employee risk. So, a lot of topics today, but, if I can leave you all with one goal, coming out of today's session, if you can kind of, think through one big takeaway. I don't like, giving too many, in these sorts of sessions here, but one big takeaway would be how is, the world of well-being evolving in a world where so much of the demographics in our workplace have changed. One of the themes we'll talk about today, really relies on this idea of what I'll describe as kind of the changing demographics in the workplace. And, what I mean by that is that so much of not just who we are and how we engage with one another has changed simply in terms of remote work, digital first infrastructure, et cetera. But we are undergoing a fundamental shift in the workforce today. We are starting to see new changes, new evolutions in how people are engaging with each other, but more importantly, the types of folks that are staffing our organizations, that are going to be staffing our organizations in the future, and the way that they define well-being, the way that the newer generations are asking and thinking about what it means to feel safe, welcomed, and candidly connected to the job that they're working in. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. But again, if you can leave with one takeaway, it's how is the world of well-being being impacted by technology and demographic changes in today's workforce? So with that, let's jump into the content. So I'm going to fly around a little bit here, and we're going to start with this stat. We'll come back to the slides we just ran over on the evolution of employee programs, but I want to start you off with one data point. I'm a big data guy being in a data company. And before we jump into, what this stat and the impact it, sort of references for, today's conversation, I'll just tell you a bit about who I am and who Fama is. So, Fama, we're a software company sitting in the talent screening space, and really what we do is bring the dimension of who somebody is in text, image, and video into the talent screening process. In other words, that for years have been doing the same sorts of things when it comes to trying to determine quality of hire and limit risk, right? We've tried to get a read on how, for example, a person is going to treat others when they join. How have they normalized aberrant behavior, for example, such as illegal drugs in the workplace violence, right? We've used drug tests, we've used interviews, we've used all these different methods and ideas to try to get a sense, an answer to that simple question: how's this person going to act when they join around customers, around fellow employees, right? And so that's who we are and what we do. This is not an infomercial for Fama, but again, just want to give you some context and my point of view and my experience in the market. And one of those is this big change here, where we are seeing now 50% of the US workforce being made up of digital natives. That number is going to climb to 75% in 4 years. And what that means effectively is that Gen Z and millennials have made up 50% of the workforce today. If I extrapolate to the world population and include Generation Alpha, which were folks that were born in 2010 and later, and I know it sounds crazy, especially to a old millennial like me, but Alpha is now finding its way into the workforce. This is the first summer that internships are happening for 14 and 15-year-olds. And we're starting to see more and more of those people finding their way into the workforce. 70% of the world's population right now is either millennial, Gen Z, or Generation Alpha. And guess what? All of them are digital natives. All of them grew up with social media just like they grew up with their online identity. All of them today, instead of in large parts, this is not a broad brush. Everybody is different. Everybody is unique, as we always heard in first grade. But at the same time, there's a lot of similarity in how folks engage, right? These are people who might be, working remotely in a distributed workforce, and they might be connecting with people on TikTok or on LinkedIn or on Reddit or on Discord before they're meeting in person over the water cooler, right? So very different than even 20 years ago when I entered the workforce, sort of the ways that we engage and the ways that we see those around us, right? So bouncing back a little bit now, let's stick with that demographic idea and jump into what I'll call like the evolution of employee programs, right? And so we've sort of drifted into this, sort of, and I'll spare my socio-political commentary on why I think this is the case, but we've really seen a fundamental shift over the past 70 years or so in the role that the employer plays in civil society, in the personal life and the professional life of the individual here in the United States, but also internationally and abroad, right? I would say, generally there was this kind of basic idea that the employer's responsibility was to just make sure that, you were not drawing down the health of other people, right? So being able to quit smoking, stop smoking in offices, right? You started to see, the government, employers in general begin coming in and saying, hey, let's start looking at, fitness, quitting smoking, et cetera, that then evolved into, ways that, employers could engage with governmental institutions on everything from, stress reduction, preventative care. But the, 2000s and 2010s almost brought this fundamental shift in the role of the employer in the life of the employee and the importance that that employer, assigned to the life of the employee and vice versa. And so, we've seen this kind of fundamental shift over the years of this kind of very hands-off, hey, I'm just your employer, make sure that you're breathing when you come in type thing, make sure that, we have preventative care programs like ERISA where relevant. But in the 2000s and 2010s, and one could argue as political and religious systems in the United States began to be, less popular with newer generations, that the world of work took on new prominence and preeminence in the eyes of the employee, right? That's when things like on-site gyms, lactation rooms, mental health care in the workplace really became a lot more popular, right? And now, that's kind of evolved into something very different. And I think we're still living through this really kind of unique moment where there are a lot of questions around what is the role of the employer, right? I think we saw on one end of the spectrum, employers who were being asked and CEOs were asked, to comment on social issues that were happening from, 2020 through 22, 23, et cetera. And that has kind of tapered off a bit. You see less and less, or fewer and fewer, excuse me, CEOs who are coming into the market and talking about the way that they see the world as if they were politicians, right? But what we've seen persist is this idea that the employer and the regulatory environment kind of, has traced this sort of change through, regulatory changes at the industry level, at, some of the regulatory bodies, whether it's the FCRA in the UK or the FCRA in the United States, the FTC, et cetera. Even, some elements of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, changes to where the responsibilities of the employer lies when it comes to holistic physical, mental, emotional, financial, social, as you see here, role in the workplace, right? And where that's kind of shaken out is, what is the role of the employer in 2025, right? As far as driving employee well-being, what is the specific set of responsibilities that that employer must undertake to create, a safe and welcoming workplace, right? And so that's kind of the big, theme we'll be talking about today, is over this employee and program evolution over time, what I'll just call, well-being in the workplace on sort of broad strokes. How has that evolved to accommodate some of these changes in the workplace, but also where has the world kind of landed when it comes to, what the actual responsibility for an employer is? And so we'll talk about, a couple of cases, but I'll focus first, on, the new type of risk that employers are really contending with, right? This, simple idea that, it is no longer risk that's happening in an analog environment, but really risk that's happening in what I'll call the online sphere and the online space. So I'll encourage you to kind of pay attention to two posts here. If you're familiar with Variety and New York Post, I'm sure you might have seen some of these articles around entertainment personalities or bankers who had said things online that led them to be terminated from an organization. But what I'd really draw your attention to today, as it relates to well-being and the responsibility of the employer, are those two headlines, those torn headlines there in the top right and the bottom left. Last year, and we'll jump into this case and the specifics because it's an important one, but last year was the first time that the Ninth Circuit in California ruled that employers could be held liable for what was happening between employees on social media, online, even outside of work, right? Off-duty conduct, things that had happened outside of the workplace, were now finding their way into the court system and finding their way into, call it, what I'll say is the kind of liability foundation for a range of employers in the United States. And so, for the very first time, the Ninth Circuit said, yeah, employer, you're actually responsible in the same way that you're responsible for reducing physical harassment in the workplace. You're responsible for identifying harassment that's happening online between your employees. Now, this was like a fundamental change, but again, kind of reference shift from, not just, the types of risk that people cared about, but the form that that risk presents itself, right? And I draw you back to that first thing we talked about, which is this idea of demographic changes in the workplace, with both employers and regulatory bodies beginning to evolve, not just what types of risks they track and how they track it, what responsibilities that they incur, what are the liabilities that they now own, not just through the lens of risk as it's happening and the way that it occurs, but really these demographic changes in the workforce, where we're now seeing, okay, if half of my workplace are made up of digital natives, that number is going to climb to 75% by 2030. For years, I've been responsible for managing physical harassment, making sure that, a woman isn't sexually harassed in the workplace, right? That someone isn't, treated unfairly because of their disability or their ethnicity in the workplace, right? That someone, for example, isn't going to scrib a note down and put it, on, or maybe leave it in a cafeteria or in a bathroom that has, a hit list of people that they want to take out inside of their company, right? Instead of that being analog, those same questions are being asked digitally, right? And so we'll come back, to this stat a little bit later, but I'll just give you a little bit more clarity on, this particular case. It happened to be, the specific example of somebody that was, calling someone who just happened to be, Latino inside of their company, calling them an illegal immigrant and saying that they need to get out of their country, get out of their warehouse in particular, right? And this was something that the employee, legal citizen, American citizen, was able to sue for and say, hey, look, in the same way that, if someone had said this to me in person in the workplace, now we're starting to say, okay, that same thing happening online is creating liability for our organization, right? And so I share this simply to sort of evidence and illustrate the shifting sands beneath our feet as employers and the changes that we're starting to see that are happening between employers today and their responsibility vis-a-vis, their employees that they have, right? And so, we're finding ourselves in a position where no longer are the signals and signs of risk exclusively relegated to the analog environment, but we're also seeing kind of a clustering of where the responsibility for well-being comes into place, right? Where I think we almost over-indexed in the 2000 to 2020 period, where you had a lot of employers that were, in the tech industry putting slides in offices, right? I think we all remember when Facebook, there was that article about them having a vending machine in like 2012 that had Beats headphones in it or something like that, that any employee with a badge could go in there and swipe. These veritable utopias where, employers would say, oh, we're responsible end to end and we're here to help. But where that has kind of shaken out is employers are saying, you know what? Maybe you're not responsible for putting a slide in the workplace. Maybe you're not responsible for, creating a condition where, people would suddenly claim injury because they no longer have access to, their chicken Caesar salad that's been craft made by the, cafeteria that we got from this Michelin guide restaurant or something like that, and a shift to come in. So as much as we've seen this kind of reversion to the mean, to this kind of more basic set of principles of employer responsibility when it comes to well-being, we're now seeing some pretty clear lines and clear definitions where regulators are now telling us, which is largely one of the ways we can kind of see where things are shaking out, that there are certain sets of responsibilities that employers are liable for, and they're very simple. They're related to, for regulated industry, the continued contribution to meeting the regulatory requirement environment, but also simple principles like safety. And I don't mean psychological safety, where if somebody says something that's, offensive to you, or, maybe you don't like it, they're an existing employee at the company, right? Very different than a new hire. Employers, sure, they'll maybe provide some counseling and some intervention to make sure that people don't talk to each other that way. But when it comes down to things like workplace violence, when it comes down to things like threats that are made between individuals, right? When it comes down to, saying things that are intolerant of other people, that make them feel alienated, that make them feel, in a way non-productive, in a company, right? Imagine someone calling you an illegal immigrant and, are you really going to be that focused in the next meeting? Are you going to be that locked in on the materials, the outcomes, or the tasks, the activities that you're beginning to generate, right? And that's really where, the letter of the law is saying that employers are responsible for creating not just a sense of, what I'll call, food well-being or slides in the office well-being, but very simply being safe in the workplace, physically safe in that workplace where, the signals and signs of risk, are things that have been identified and accommodated in a way that reflects these changes in the workplace, right? And so I think we've seen this really unique shift over time, just to recap, between very basic principles of what well-being and the responsibility of the employer meant vis-a-vis the engagement with the employee, extrapolated into, in that 2000 to 2015 period, 2020, this fundamental shift in, oh, employers have to create, they have to have a political stance on topics. Employers have to have the slide in the office, the incredible benefits programs for all their employees, right? And now we've seen kind of a reversion, a sort of shift back to what I would call kind of the center when it comes to the overall set of fundamental and basic responsibilities that an employer has to incur, which includes some big benefits, right? FMLA changes that we've seen in terms of, leave that employees are allowed to take, but also big fundamental shifts in the recognition that toxic behavior in the workplace can lead to materially negative outcomes for employees. That's the other big shift that, we'll kind of talk about now, right? And so, this is a complex idea and topic that we'll spend a little bit of time on, and we'll kind of refer to this as kind of like the escalation of toxic behaviors, but you can also think about this as the kind of manifestation, the one of my kids' favorite words, the transmorgification. I think that's what one of my sons is locked on these days. I don't even know where he like heard that word, but anyway, that's a whole nother story. General idea here being is that, as much as these risks are now things that employers are held responsible for, again, things like workplace violence, harassment in the workplace, things they've always been responsible now, just albeit in different forms, digital forms as they manifest and present themselves. How those risks occur and how they manifest and how they escalate in the organization is really important. And so again, like now we've kind of covered the shifting demographics in the workplace, the way that people live, the different types of risk, things that again, people have always been, employers have always been responsible for, but as that risk became increasingly digital, how employers have become increasingly responsible for that risk, a shift towards, or back to what I'll call kind of the basics around well-being, that still kind of leaves employers in the lurch because now they're sitting here saying to themselves, all right, well, if I'm responsible in, my office for workplace, misconduct or signals of risk that maybe have, been less so than the political stances CEOs were required to take, that sort of thing. But now I'm responsible for harassment in the workplace that's online between individuals. How am I supposed to identify that? In other words, how could I be anything but reactive to that information? That's what a lot of our clients are asking us is they're saying like, sure, I understand that I'm liable. It makes sense to me that half my workforce now are digital natives, digitally connected, that if I was responsible for harassment between employees before and creating a safe and welcoming workplace, if I was responsible for managing workplace violence incidents, if I was responsible for ensuring that people weren't high at work, that now I have to do that same thing, but in a way that, reflects the more digital nature of how folks engage with each other and where risk presents itself. Sure, that all makes sense, but at the same time, now you're talking about being reactive. Now you're talking about just taking action when something happens. So when we think about the manifestation of risk, you have to kind of look to the very beginning. Risk just doesn't occur in an organization. It's not just something that happens, right? When somebody harasses another person, when someone makes that racist comment, and then a bunch of people gang up on that individual, calling somebody who's Latino an illegal immigrant on no basis whatsoever besides their own prejudice, that doesn't just happen in a company and, oh my gosh, there's no signal, there's no way we could have identified this, there's no way we could have prevented it, because the manifestation of toxic behavior in the workplace follows these 4 steps here. And we'll go kind of through these one by one, but it starts with exposure, acceptance, we can also call that normalization, advocacy, and then participation, right? So in other words, exposure, I'll put this in simple terms that aren't all, slide charty. Just made that word up, slide charty. The first is exposure, right? Let's say I see somebody saying something, harassing in the workplace to a person, right? And I'm a new hire. I didn't say anything. I'm just kind of watching it unfold, but I saw this, kind of happen in my organization, right? And so, someone says, this harassing or toxic comment to a person. Maybe they make the comment, call someone an illegal immigrant who is most obviously not. They just happen to have a certain color of skin and be from a certain place, right? But then nobody says anything. Maybe somebody laughs. Maybe there's kind of a joke, right? Maybe someone thinks it's just too awkward to intervene on behalf of that other person and they can handle it, right? Well, that's when that second step comes into play, acceptance. Repeated exposure and normalization of aberrant behavior begins to be accepted by other people. And worse yet, then people begin to advocate for it, right? This is something that might sound, crazy. Why would any of my employees at my company begin advocating for aberrant behavior like that, for hateful content between individuals? But if nobody checks that person, if no one in a position in a vertical organization specifically, if nobody in a position of authority is going to come in and intervene on that sort of aberrant behavior in the workplace, that then becomes participation, where people are actively committing different types of misconduct, transitioning from advocate to contributor, right? And so that participation is when likely the real event happens, right? Sure, maybe they were, someone said, oh, one comment I could sweep under the rug, right? But 2, 3, 4 comments by more people making the same jokes, piling on this individual, that is when you cross the threshold from somebody maybe being a little bit uncomfortable in the workplace to somebody saying, I can't work, I'm not productive, I don't feel like my employer not even feel, my employer has not created objectively a safe and welcoming workplace that's going to put me in a position where I feel as an individual, where I know as an individual, I can do my best and brightest work, right? And so we've seen these kind of costs bear out, right? And these are things, again, that kind of start small, but then become, increasingly normalized over time. And so this is where we'll talk a little bit about how to address it, how to kind of nip it in the bud, because good people leave. You don't have to, create a whole deck for that, but good people leave an organization in a toxic work environment, right? Good employees, this is a study from Harvard and a company called Cornerstone On Demand, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that from 2015 that they did this research that in toxic work environments, good employees are 54% more likely to leave. Productivity drops by 40%, and 1.3 million violent crimes committed every year in the workplace, right? And so the question then becomes for the employer, I think we would all agree, these are things that, employers do have a role in creating a safe and welcoming workplace, doing the bare minimum to ensure that nobody is violently assaulted, there's no violent crime, that there's no harassment in the workplace, that there's no illegal drug use, that again, we're keeping that kind of bare minimum, that bright line. We're not saying, oh, well, we need a slide in the office, or our CEO has to have a opinion on all these social issues, and we want her to go out and be an evangelist for the community. No, it's much more these days in 2025. How can employers create a workplace and an office environment that is aligned with what I'll just call the bare minimum types of standards? And that's really where we see companies these days turning to what's happening online, right? And so I think when it comes to of employee screening, right? When it comes to this idea of even monitoring an existing workforce, there's like this ick factor that a lot of employers have, right? Why would you need to monitor what, jokes people are making, or why would you need to, monitor what, your employees are saying online, their political behavior, their pregnancy announcements, right? Like those sorts of things, why would we care about any of that, right? And it's a great question. You shouldn't. You absolutely shouldn't. The idea of monitoring, I think, in legacy types of technology, especially some of like the surveillance software that's being used by a range of companies, whether that's for like keystroke monitoring or what's happening on devices, et cetera. That's a realm of surveillance that is very detailed and very focused. And I think that there are a lot of questions from employees about like, what's the purpose of doing this? What's the purpose of giving, this level of surveillance, to our HR or talent teams or our ER teams more generally, when we don't really need it, right? Where we see a lot of employers turning on monitoring per se and employee screening is really in the realm of being very specific to the types of risk that we're talking about today. In other words, ensuring that, if somebody is making a violent threat about an individual, if someone is threatening customers online, that those are things that most employees at a company would want to know about from one of their fellow coworkers, right? If somebody is acting harassing and hateful towards a fellow employee on the internet, that's something they would want to know about. If somebody is talking about getting high at work, that's something employers would want to know about, right? But the big shift here, the big change, is that because so much of the workforce is digitally connected, these risks are now appearing online as opposed to offline. And that's the shift that's kind of throwing employers for a loop, right? Where suddenly they have all these new responsibilities under, what it means to create, well-being in the workplace, what it means to identify signals of misconduct, but the format of that misconduct is now coming through, social media and who we are online. So where we see, Fama in particular, companies turning on workplace monitoring is really for this idea of, people who talk about hurting people who talk about being high at work, people talk about, beating up on customers. And you might be listening to what I'm saying and being like, what is this dude talking about? No one is going online and talking about whether or not, somebody is going to hurt somebody at their workplace. No one would ever do that, right? Well, you would be surprised. Your mind would be blown. These are three examples I'm just going to share with you that, we identified just in the past 12 months of different types of risk that have appeared through existing employee rescreening. So one, these are all true. I'm not going to get too deep into the details, but one, a workplace shooter. For one of our customers, they had a lot of concerns about violence in the workplace in particular. There were a lot of different questions around, some signs of risk. This was a company that did work, I'll just say, inside and outside of the office, and, workers' comp claims, people that were injured on the job were a part of their business, right? And a lot of folks were disaffected as to whether or not those claims got paid out. There happened to be one individual at this company who, from a workers' comp perspective, didn't, receive the treatment that he thought he deserved. Went online, started naming executives and talking about people he was going to hurt. Luckily, we caught that in a video that person recorded, identified that to ER, and they got law enforcement involved and got that person the help they needed without anything bad ever happening. So that was a great scenario for us where we identified the sort of risk we're talking about. Hospital and healthcare system, again, a true story. People wanted to look at, they thought just, social media for violence and intolerance. They got way more. They found that, there was a doctor who was literally selling body parts on Twitter and linking to a dark web, marketplace that he was running. And third, was actually, it says teacher here, but a racist principal of a school who was posting things publicly online that were racist about the kids that she was leading in a very well-to-do school district in the central part of the United States. So, it's a long way of saying, like, I think so many of us, when it thinks about workplace monitoring, when we think about identifying the seed of that risk, there is that kind of, should I really be doing this, right? But when it comes down to being very specific about what you can and can't do, what you see and what you don't see, using technology to kind of overcome any privacy implications related to seeing things about a person's political beliefs, et cetera. But if you could have monitoring that only flagged a person that were doing something like this, that's where we see employers really drifting to this new type of, I'll just say, like, workforce screening. And again, I don't think this is anything different than what employers have been doing for years. And in fact, the regulatory environment is kind of catching up where they're saying, like, for years, you've cared about workplace violence. All three of these things, I am sure employers would be like, yeah, no, duh. Of course we want to know about that information. Of course we want to know about a workplace shooter. Of course, if one of our doctors is selling body parts online, and especially if a principal is saying racist things about kids, if they said that in the school, if they said that at a council meeting, that person would be out immediately, or at the very least intervened and told, that that's not okay at this company. But where we see this shift is now employers saying, all right, I've cared about these things for decades. Now the law is telling me I'm responsible for what's happening online related to these matters between people at my company. And then how do I turn on solutions, that enable us to be able to identify that risk before it manifests and reaches from observance to active, participation. So a lot here. We'll go, a couple more minutes before we jump into questions, but just to, be very, very clear about how employee screening works. We are not seeing any employers that we work with today, zero, that will go and say, hey, I want to know about, whether or not someone is making a off-color joke. I don't really care if somebody is like trolling people on the internet, right? Like, this person's in our company, we trust them. Where employers really are focused are on a few key areas: workplace violence, threats, illegal drug use, and crime. Those are the 4 areas that we see employers continuing to kind of identify and screen for. And that's where, the employee screening solution, the general idea is like, you define what's misconduct for your organization. You define risk. Now, that might be different based on the regulatory environment that you're in. If you're in, the UK, for example, and you work in financial services, the Financial Conduct Authority last month, 34 days ago, this was just recent, came out with guidance that said that employers are responsible for any violence happening between bankers on the job where signal was available online prior, or anything that could impact the regulatory environment in which the bank operates, right? And so now we're starting to see, Ninth Circuit in the United States, the FCA in the UK, a few influential regulatory bodies and court systems that are starting to say, hey, look, like, if there is risk that you care about, that is central to your operations or is central to your compliance with the regulatory bodies that govern the way that you operate and the way that you work, you got to be able to identify that sort of thing if it happens online, right? And so that's where the power starts, is you define what risk looks like. The solution then is only going to filter and flag anybody that has said one of those things online, right? We're not talking about scoring people. We're not telling you who's good or who's bad. This isn't Minority Report where we're like predicting crime or predicting who's going to be a good person. But I think we, like many HR professionals, like, we know that people know what to do with this information. If somebody makes a violent threat against an individual at your company, you have a playbook for that. If somebody says something related to stealing from the office, you know what to do about that, right? If somebody talks about getting high at work, you know what to do about that. If someone talks about committing any other crime and admitting to it, you know what to do with that information. So the general idea with monitoring is that we're, calling balls and strikes. We're coming in and we're saying, hey, look, like, this is somebody who made a violent threat based on your policy. Here's the person who they named. You should go adjudicate this and make sure whether or not, there's a risk here. At least do your bare responsibility, the bare minimum in terms of managing this type of risk and creating what I'll describe as that kind of, safe and overall, welcoming workplace for, your constituents. The third piece here is the investigation and the intervention. I'm sure many of you have had to deal with this stuff before. You've had to deal in the past with, things that have happened, that kind of late night phone call, right? Before, the last call that you want to receive, on, oh my gosh, this event happened. How do we deal with it, right? Well, what you start to see with the online record is early signal of this sort of thing appearing, right? And so the online record is going to give you a lot of that early insight, potentially before that workplace violence happens, before, hopefully before the theft or drug use occurs inside of your organization, making sure that these sorts of things are immediately obvious and apparent to you at a source level, right? And so that's where this investigation and intervention question, I think, gets really interesting, because now we're saying, look, like, what if, we catch somebody when they make the threat, right? What if we catch somebody, when they talk about attempting to steal or their disaffection with the company, right? I think so much of what we've seen in the past is this, general idea, that we're able really, to identify these things before they become a problem, right? Identify these things before they become an issue. And sometimes this can be as simple as saying, like, hey, we know you made this, joke about, punching the customer in the face, or maybe you said this because you're having a bad day, but we just want to let you know that that sort of behavior at our company is not okay, is not something that, we want to identify, right? Or that we want to think of as part of our brand, of our culture, of how we want to work and how we want to engage. And I'll take you back, and to just a couple of slides here, back to our, escalation slide here. The idea of intervention, the role of employee screening, is really to try to find your way into the exposure and acceptance phase of the manifestation of toxic behavior in the workplace, right? This is really where workplace monitoring, particularly on just dimensions related to violence, threats, criminal behavior, illegal drug use, right? Only flagging for that information and nothing else. That's where that exposure and acceptance comes into play, right? Because if all your employees are on, let's just say, like a LinkedIn group or a Discord chat, or, call it like just making stuff up, a TikTok, group chat or something like that, right? And they start to see that people are, saying things that are racist or homophobic, right? Or, or doing things that might be, precursors to potential violence, saying things like, man, I'm so fed up with my boss. Like, if he says one more thing, I swear I'm gonna, like, show him, who's the real boss here, right? Those sorts of things. That is the exposure phase. And identifying and intervening before that exposure becomes acceptance. That's really what we're talking about here, is identifying at that root moment before this violence manifests itself, at the stage at which the regulatory bodies are saying, hey, look, employers are responsible for this baseline level of risk. That's really where we're starting to see a lot of, customers kind of, begin to adopt this new type of technology here. So sorry to bounce around a bit, but I think it's really important to contextualize where this is occurring in the employee experience. That, one, you can be very specific and define exactly what you want to screen for. You can conduct these screenings against very specific employee risk factors and investigate and intervene in that acceptance exposure phase of the, manifestation overall of misconduct in your workplace. So, that's a general idea here. It doesn't have to be terminating somebody. It can be simply saying, hey, look, like, that sort of stuff doesn't fly at our company. That's not how we want to behave. That's not how we want to treat, the people who make our company, what it is today. So I did see a question here from Christy. Thanks a lot, Christy. It said, what if their accounts are set to private? That totally fine. We're not looking at anything that's private. It's only publicly available information that's out there, right? And again, this kind of gets at, this idea of not just what's right and what's fair and what's the expectation from employees. Do you think employees would expect that their private social media would be vetted by their employers on an ongoing basis? I don't think so. They don't ask about private analog conversations that happen when you leave the office. They don't ask you for a recap of, your call home with your spouse that you have, on, the way home from work every day to kill the commute time. But what they would ask for is, hey, if that person is publicly saying things that are, violent or hateful or alienating people who work for them, right? Like that's relevant. And so I think the general idea here, and I always encourage folks to kind of think about questions like this, is like the idea of digital identity. Disconnect yourself from the role of who we are online and who we are offline. The same principles and concepts of what employers have been required to manage, the line has moved over the years. It went from bare minimum, like make sure the person's breathing and healthy, to, this whole other end of the spectrum of, workplace considerations. And I'll say the peak was like the slides in tech offices and the vending machines with headphones, and all those other little, cafes inside of big corporate headquarters, right? That, were sort of the epitome of the overindulgence of the employer and the employee, where now things have sort of returned to this level where I would argue there are things that they've always cared about employers. Employers have always cared about balance in the workplace. They've always cared about illegal drug use. They've always cared about people treating people unfairly because of what they look like and where they come from. So when it information online, I would ask yourself that same question. Would my employer want to know about private things in my life outside, or just what is happening in the public sphere that I've normalized and I'm going to potentially bring into where I don't see that line between public and private that I'm going to bring into the workplace? So great question, Christy, thanks a lot. So, we're coming up on, time here, and definitely want to leave some, time for Q&A and touch on, a few more of these pillars of, well-being. But this is something that is globally compliant. This is something that you can use for existing employee screening, whether you're, in the United States or over, in Europe, in the UK. All things that you can do globally in APAC, throughout the Americas as well, but doing it the right way, right? And that means not scoring people. That means not, flagging people because of their political behavior, right? That means being very specific and tying the use of this product to clear business impact and business solutions that you're seeking, again, which are related to your responsibilities as an employer as it relates to well-being, right? And so, again, the 4 pillars of wellness, we can really talk through, what this means for employees. And I think this is a good time to kind of turn it back to the audience and maybe, frame it, if you don't mind, just dropping in the chat while I'm going through this section, how you understand your role as it relates to, employees, for example, in the workplace, your role as it relates to well-being, your role as it relates to kind of creating, the minimum requirements, as it were. And if you don't feel comfortable talking about your own company, maybe you can, talk to, the hypothetical side of it. But I do think we have a poll too that I want to put out. So let's go ahead and Sylvie, maybe we can put out the poll now, if you don't mind. Here's a good question. I can't vote, so I'm gonna let you guys take this one.
And we'll just give it a minute here while we get the results in, and then we'll share the results.
Yeah, great. And while we're thinking through this, I'd love, if you don't mind jotting down and you're open to it, just sharing some perspective as you see your responsibility vis-a-vis, well-being with your employees, right? Or maybe what your company policy has been on this. Ding, ding, ding. You guys nailed it. Nailed it. 25% is the right answer here. So the Workplace Violence Act committed by current employees, a quarter of all workplace violence comes from within, right? And so a big, piece to know about, the rest being kind of external events to the company. I think so, but we have one more question. Or sorry, so do we have any more poll questions, or was that it?
We have a couple more, 3 more actually.
Great. Yeah, let's get those up and running. We can talk about them a little bit more as we go through this. sort of a basic question here on, your concerns about the safety of your employees. And I see Christy contributed here. I'm seeking to create an environment where employees bring their best self to work. Makes sense. All right, let's see where we landed here. Okay, kind of an even split about employee safety. I think this is industry specific. We can put up the other one here while maybe while I comment on this one here briefly, Christy. But yeah, we see a lot of employers in certain sectors, I think driven by some of the events that have happened over the past year or so, but financial services, healthcare in particular, insurance, we're seeing a lot of customers concerned there. Any businesses that have, again, a lot of kind of employment related claims to injuries on the job and disaffected employees. Oh, this is good. You ever had to manage a workplace violence incident? I'll be interested to see this one. It's probably going to depend on the makeup of the audience as well here. Maybe one more second. Interesting. Interesting. About a 50-50 split again. Very close. Do our last poll here. Awesome. All right, well, that's being taken care of. Let's jump into maybe another question we got here. So Denise asked, you mentioned screening employees' profiles. How is it managed when the profiles are set to private? Who is typically assigned to complete these screenings? So again, things that are private, are of really no concern, we believe, to the employer or to, the employees at the company, right? I think a lot of things happen in private outside of work that are really not the business of the employer or the other employees, right? It's when that line gets crossed and things start happening in public context that people begin seeing that kind of normalization and acceptance of, workplace misconduct as being a key and consistent theme that drives down, productivity and, causes good people to leave and unfortunately leads to some of these manifestations of material workplace misconduct. So again, I think you kind of operate under the assumption that if somebody is going to be, making jokes that are private or saying things that are private or talking about their drug use at work in private, it imparts a sense of kind of understanding there's a line between their professional and personal selves that, we're really seeking to kind of help identify. So the last thing is like, if you guys, we have one more poll question. If you would like to learn more about Fama, I think Sylvie, we can. Is there a launch button for that, or how would you like to handle that one? The learn more about Fama question.
The launch button doesn't seem to be working for that poll, so sorry about that. It might be nice if people could indicate in the chat if they'd like more information.
Yeah, if you guys would like more in the chat, definitely feel free to jump in that chat there. And, you could also connect with me on LinkedIn, come to our website, fama.io to learn more. But, connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me there, DM me, happy to kind of chat any way we see it. But look, I would just sort of leave you with the four pillars of wellness, lastly being, mental, physical, social, and financial. I think you as an employer, the big question to ask yourself is, am I doing what Christy said? Am I creating an environment where employees bring their best self to work that's free from harassment, free from, the workplace violence, legal drug use, et cetera? Am I creating a place where all people feel, they can contribute, stay connected to our mission and to what we're trying to accomplish as an organization? So a high level, and I would, Denise, answer your second question here, who is typically assigned to complete these screenings? So typically what we recommend is that there is a team inside of your organization, of course, that is adjudicating employee issues. Think of the sort of the ER team, the employee relations team. Sometimes that kind of sits in HR and shared services. But typically what we recommend is that employers create guidelines based on your code of conduct, based on your employee handbook that say these are things that are black and white, not okay at our company. Again, the certain things that we've talked about here, workplace violence, illegal drug use, criminal behavior, anything that could have a negative bearing on your regulatory compliance in the industry in which you operate. So again, not whether they like cats or dogs, what type of food they like, their favorite sports team, none of that matters. Just those specific types of risk, and having somebody in your organization who evaluates those types of posts when they come up without attaching themselves to the individual themselves, but looking at the frequency of that content, the tone of that content, and making an interpretation based on internal guidelines, and then handing over that summary based on guidelines, objective, agnostic to the individual at charge, at the center of the analysis, limiting any potential bias that's going to come up, but being able to say one-to-one, we have a policy of like workplace violence at our company, of managing it. This looks like somebody who said something violent and threatening, regardless of the context. I'm going to escalate that and then triage that to call it, more senior leader in the employee relations team in this context. So in simple terms, have the initial reviewer of the information as objective as possible, not reviewing who said what, but simply the fundamentals of the content of what they said and how they said it, and then use that information to adjudicate the next step in the process. And that's it. I think with that, we'll pause. I don't see any other questions here. There's an exit survey for you to fill out. But with that, I would just say thank you so much. For more information, come to our website or look me up on LinkedIn, Ben Mones, and we'll connect there. But Denise, anything else, or excuse me, Sylvia, anything else you want to cover before we part ways with the group today?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you thank you to Ben Mones from Fama Technologies, and to our audience as well. Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording will be available on the hr.com website within 24 hours. Your webcast credits will show in your hr.com account within 2 business days. That's your HRCI and SHRM credits. We'll also send an email with the credit information in it. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to fill out the exit survey. I launched the link there, but it will also open in a browser window on your computer. Let us know how we did. And this concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.